Some consider it dark folk, others consider it apocalyptic folk, but for the most part, it's considered neofolk. From my personal experiences, originally when I first heard neofolk, I really didn't care for it at the time. I didn't understand the sound of it. But having numerous conversations with people with all different recommendations thrown at me, I've become quite attached to neofolk over the past recent years that honestly now I consider some of the best music I've ever heard to come from the genre, that being neofolk. Which is why in this video I want to recommend you guys 7 albums to get you into neofolk. And while these albums aren't particularly my personal favorite within the genre, these are the 7 I would recommend to someone who have no idea what neofolk is but wants to get introduced to it. But to give you a brief little history of what neofolk is, it's an experimental genre of music that blends folk music along with industrial that really started picking up steam in the 1980s. And while you can pin the fact that within the 1980s the birth of neofolk emerged, others argue that some of the prototypes and harbingers that would be big influencers for what we consider neofolk today came around in the 1970s. You have Vulcan's Hammer, True Hearts, and Sound Bottoms that has a lot of the characteristics that we would consider neofolk to be, that was released in the mid-70s, having that minimalistic guitar and singing approach with it. Along with the psychedelic folk band Comus with their album To Keep From Crying that was released in 1974 that has a lot of experimentation and really reminds me a lot of some of the neo-folk bands I'm going to be talking about real soon. Yeah, I've seen a lot of conversations point towards the fact that what is considered the first ever neo-folk band is Changes, that formed back in 1969, and they were active all the way until 1977. And reformed back in the mid-90s thanks to the fact that this label rediscovered them, that being Cthulhu Records, back in 1996 as they were able to release their debut album, Fire of Life. So yeah, a bit of a brief little information to give you guys an understanding of the influence of where it started for what we consider neofolk to be today. But on now to what I consider to be the 7 best albums to get someone into neofolk. And I feel like the first 2 albums and bands are really obvious because they're considered like the face of neofolk itself, which is obviously Death in June and Current 93. Douglas Pierce and David Tibet are massive pioneers and influencers for just anything and everything that's labeled under neofolk. Also, for a little side note, I highly recommend checking out the video by Charlie Looker here on YouTube, who made a video called Death in June versus Current 93. If you want a really deep dive cut of all the little attributes that both of these projects present to you in a really in-depth discussion, I strongly recommend checking this video out if you want even a deeper kind of input as to what Death in June and Current 93 offer. But from my standpoint of a recommendation, starting off with Douglas Pierce, obviously with his project Death in June, I would recommend By What Ends When the Symbols Shatter. And while there are numerous albums out there to check out within Death in June, because he has a massive discography from albums like From Rose Clouds, The Holocaust, and All Pigs Must Die, which are great albums in themselves, By What Ends When the Symbols Shatter, I really feel like is the perfect starting point to get into neofolk as a whole, and really the best place to start out when coming towards seeking any material by Death in June. Because for one, it seems to be the fan favorite. A lot of these songs have a lot of hooks to them, which makes a lot of sense considering that Douglas Pierce used to be in a punk band, that being Crisis, back in '77. And you can tell that that influence really rubs off on him on a lot of the Death in June records, even the neofolk ones to the post-punk ones. And with By What Ends When the Symbols Shatter, there's just something about the ambience, the pacing, the vocal delivery, and the lyrics that you're going to get very immersed within this album. That I've had a lot of discussions with people saying that this is basically like acoustic Burzum, and I feel like a lot of people compare it to Burzum, considering that, again, there's just a lot of ambience smothered over the guitar playing, and it's just very enticing, and it would obviously be a big influence to that, not only of a lot of neofolk projects, but a lot of metal bands as well that blend neofolk within their sound. Because again, for one, Agalloch, The Mantle, if you enjoy that album, especially all the folk instruments being played within it, it's highly influenced by Death in June. As for David Tibet, obviously with his project Current 93, I would strongly recommend checking out the album Thunder Perfect Mind. Again, just like Death in June, Current 93 has a massive discography that you could check out. That honestly, if you were to check out just solely Current 93 and Death in June, you can get lost within their discographies for months. And while you can argue that there are other great Current 93 albums to start off with, like with All the Pretty Little Horses and Swastikas for Naughty, I really feel like Thunder Perfect Mind is the best place to start out with. Not only because it's the fan favorite again for a lot of Current 93 fans, but really you get the best of both worlds with this album on how David Tibet writes folk music. Because this album runs for a little over an hour long, and for the first 30 minutes of it, you're going to get more of the traditional sense of what folk music is, and more of like David Tibet's approach within neofolk. Because, see, his singing is kind of like an acquired taste at first, because it's not necessarily like the traditional sense of what singing really is. He has like a blend more of like singing and talking at the same time. I don't know the exact word for what that is, that approach, but again, definitely check out Charlie Looker's video all about it, because he gives a more in-depth description about it. And it comes off more like a narrative than the traditional sense of singing. So again, for the first 30 minutes, you're going to get more of a deep understanding of what Current 93 kind of sounds like. However, when you pass the halfway point, this is really where the more experimental aspect of Current 93 bleeds through, and it doesn't lose any sense of the neofolk styles, just again, however, more of like the electronic and the industrial tinge moments come through. That gets a bit nightmarish in some sense, but still, again, it's a phenomenal album that I would recommend is the best place to start out with if you want to get acquired to what Current 93 sounds like. Now, while a lot of people have a debate as to who is the face of neofolk, either between David Tibet with Current 93 or Douglas Pierce with Death in June, there are a handful of other artists out there within neofolk that kind of like are third-wheeling them. And I would say the one that's on top of the line, just behind those two, is Tony Wakeford with his band Soul Invictus that formed back in 1987. And funny enough, Tony used to be with Douglas Pierce with his band Crisis. He was the bass player, but when they disbanded back in, like, I think 1980, Tony Wakeford used to be with Douglas Pierce with Death in June for a handful of years until he was basically kicked out of it. And it wasn't until like a few years later he started up Soul Invictus. And while Soul Invictus has a pretty large discography and you can point in any direction as to what's the best place to start out with them, I would say the best album of theirs is the 1995 full-length album, In the Rain, because while neofolk is obviously present within it, it's the blend of modern classical music that's laced together with it that may be simplistic on one hand, but becomes really breathtaking and melancholic on the other. As for a recommendation that isn't one of the OGs within neofolk, I would strongly recommend Rome, mainly composed by Jerome Reuter with his 2019 full-length album Li Scenari di Helidoro. Hopefully I said somewhat of that correct. And honestly, really, you can check out any of Rome's full-length albums, and they're all high-end, because I've always considered Rome to make neofolk that should be categorized as like stadium neofolk. Because when you listen to them, the production value is just at this super high-end volume that really, I would say Rome is the most exciting and accessible out of everything within this list. That really, again, just everything just feels so grandiose for neofolk that whether it be the instrumentation or Jerome's voice that's very, massive, robust, and masculine sounding, I would definitely say this is one of the very first Neofolk albums to get me really invested within the genre. Of course, I feel like I would have to recommend Of the Wand and the Moon, mainly composed by Kim Larson with the 2006 full-length album Sonnenheim. Now, a lot of people typically compare Of the Wand and the Moon to that of Death in June, mainly because Kim Larson has stated numerous times that he's heavily influenced by Douglas Pierce's approach with Neofolk. However, I would say one of the big differences between the two is that Of the Wand and the Moon is just way more gothic influenced, I would say, in some cases. That if you want kind of like Death in June, but more of like the gothic rock approach to it in some cases, definitely check out Of the Wand and the Moon. Second to last recommendation, I gotta give it to Blood Axis with their debut album, The Gospel of Inhumanity, mainly composed by Michael Moynihan and Annabelle Lee. This particular album right here showcases really just the high-end artistic value that Neofolk can give a listener, because for the most part, there really isn't any singing. Actually, there's none at all other than some spoken word parts and audio samples scattered throughout it. Because this album is way more instrumentally driven, having a lot of modern classical and industrial elements utilized within it, but every single song feels so distinct from each track, but doesn't sacrifice any of like this dark kind of like dreary dystopian kind of sound that they're giving off. And seriously guys, every minute of this album is just ear candy from start to finish. The opening song on here has like a blend of like electronic, industrial, guitars, and kind of like these choirs that pop through that give Neofolk a very surreal sound that really kicks off the album again in a very breathtaking dystopian way. But then when you get to the songs The Voyage and even the closing track Storm of Steel, there's an electronic bass that comes through that almost gives off like a doom metal aspect with this album with some of the riffs. So again, as I stated, this album, each track has like a distinct sound with it that again is just really creative, and I would say in terms of like the artistic value of Neofolk, this album is like the peak of that take. And the final recommendation, which I'm trying not to be biased, but I truly do feel like this is the greatest Neofolk, apocalyptic folk, dark folk, whatever you want to call it, album ever, that is like the best for last, and there's just no denying it that whether you're new to Neofolk or a die-hard veteran listener, there's no denying just how incredible this album is. And obviously I'm talking about Nature and Organization, Beauty Reaps the Blood of Solitude. Just the lineup alone proves my point as to why this is like the greatest Neofolk album ever. You got David Tibet, Douglas Pierce, Rose McDowell, Michael Cashmore, and a handful of other musicians all coming together in like this all-star cast of like Neofolk artists to make this monumental piece of music that it's just too good for words, honestly. The flow of this album is just gorgeous. Regardless of what emotion they're giving off, whether it be in a positive, negative, or even in a narrative aspect, it's just like so beautiful. It's like almost too good for words, and I consider it one of the greatest albums ever made, and just again, hands down, the best Neofolk album that when you're done with the previous 6 and you really want like, the cherry on top of like this Neofolk recommendation, ice cream sundae, whatever have you, this is it. Like, this is like the pinnacle of what the genre is capable of. And I don't care, and any conversation when it comes to recommendations or talking about Neofolk, this has to be brought up. And that'll do it for the 7 albums I would recommend getting you into Neofolk. Like always, links will be provided to everything I talked about in the description below, and that is that. So like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.